February 1942. Liverpool, England. Inside a cramped attic room on the top floor of Derby House, something impossible is happening. A 21-year-old woman is crawling across the floor on her hands and knees. She's holding a piece of green chalk. Around her, the most powerful admirals in the British Royal Navy are watching in complete silence. She draws a single line. Then another. Then she stands up, brushes off her skirt, and says 5 words that will change the entire war. The U-boats are inside the convoy. No one moves. No one speaks. Because what she just said defies everything the Royal Navy has believed for 3 years. Every doctrine. Every assumption. Every tactic. And she's not a naval officer. She's not a captain. She's not even a sailor. She's a former insurance clerk from London who has never set foot on a warship. Her name is Jean Laidlaw. And in the next 18 months, the tactics she develops on that dusty floor will help sink more German submarines than any weapon, any ship, any technology the Allies possess. This is the story of how one young woman, armed with nothing but chalk and mathematics, broke the deadliest killing machine in the Atlantic. Now, before I tell you how Jean Laidlaw saved thousands of lives, you need to understand something that in early 1942, Britain was dying. Not from bombs. Not from invasion, from starvation. German U-boats were strangling the Atlantic supply lines with terrifying efficiency. Every week, dozens of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and medicine were torpedoed and sent to the bottom of the ocean. The men who commanded these submarines called it the happy time. Because for them they were winning, and no one in the British Navy understood how. Convoys of 40, 50, sometimes 60 ships would set sail from Halifax or New York, surrounded by armed escort destroyers. They followed every protocol. They maintained formation. They had lookouts scanning every direction. And still, ships in the middle of the convoy, the most protected ships, would suddenly explode point one after another. Like clockwork. Then the U-boats would vanish. The escorts would search for hours. Nothing. It was as if the submarines were ghosts. Someone was doing the impossible. No one knew how. And the answer would come from the last person anyone expected. Jean Laidlaw was not born to be a war hero. She was born to be invisible. Growing up in London in the 1920s, she was quiet, bookish, unremarkable by every conventional measure. She didn't come from money. She didn't come from military tradition. Her family had no connections to the Admiralty, no legacy of service, no seat at any table. That mattered. When she finished school, she did what young women of modest means did in those days. She got a job as an insurance clerk, filing papers, processing claims, calculating premiums. It was boring work, repetitive, but Jean had one unusual quality that set her apart. She could see patterns. Numbers spoke to her in a language most people couldn't hear. Where others saw columns of figures, she saw relationships. Connections. Sequences that told stories. Her supervisors noticed. They gave her more complex calculations. She solved them faster than anyone in the office. But it didn't matter. She was still just a clerk, still invisible, still a woman in a world that didn't believe women belonged anywhere near strategy, warfare, or decision-making. Then September 1939 arrived, and everything changed. When war broke out, Jean Laidlaw volunteered for the Women's Royal Naval Service. The Wrens. It wasn't a glamorous choice. Wrens were expected to cook meals, drive trucks, type letters, and stay far away from anything resembling actual combat. But Jean wasn't looking for glamour. She was looking for purpose. She was sent to Greenwich Naval College for officer training, and there she excelled in ways her instructors didn't expect. Her mathematical aptitude caught the attention of one woman in particular, Vera Lawton Matthews. Vera was the director of the Women's Royal Naval Service, a fierce feminist who had sold copies of the Suffragette in her youth and believed with every fiber of her being that women could do anything men could do. She was building something secret. A team of exceptional women. Not typists. Not drivers, high achievers, athletes, mathematicians. Women who could think under pressure. In February 1942, Vera made Jean Laidlaw her first recruit. Jean was 21 years old. She had no idea what she was walking into. To understand what Jean Laidlaw was about to face, you need to understand how desperate Britain had become. By early 1942, German Admiral Karl Donitz had perfected a killing strategy called the Wolf Pack. Instead of sending submarines out individually to hunt, Donitz spread them across the Atlantic in long patrol lines. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it wouldn't attack immediately. It would radio headquarters. Then Donitz would vector in 10, 15, sometimes 20 submarines to converge on the same target. They attacked at night. They attacked in waves. They were relentless. The numbers were catastrophic. In 1941, U-boats sank 875 Allied ships. In the first 6 months of 1942, that pace accelerated. Between January and July 1942, nearly 400 Allied ships went down. U-boat losses during that same period. 7.7 submarines lost while destroying 400 ships. The ratio was unsustainable. Britain imported everything: food, fuel, raw materials, weapons. Without those convoys, the island would collapse within months. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. He couldn't sleep. He read the casualty reports every morning and felt the noose tightening. The Royal Navy was failing, their tactics weren't working, their technology wasn't enough, and no one could figure out why. The institutional response was what it always is when institutions are failing: blame, excuses, stubbornness. The admirals insisted their doctrine was sound. They had been trained by men who fought in the First World War. Their tactics had worked then, they should work now. If ships were sinking, it must be because captains weren't following orders properly. If U-boats were escaping, it must be because crews weren't vigilant enough. The problem couldn't be the system, because the system was never wrong. I need to tell you about a convoy called SC-7. October 1940. 35 merchant ships, 0.6 escort vessels. Sailing from Sydney, Nova Scotia to Liverpool, England. It should have been a routine crossing. It became a massacre. Over 3 days, German wolf packs attacked without mercy. 20 ships sunk. 140 sailors killed. The escorts were helpless. They could hear the torpedoes hitting, they could see the flames, they could hear men screaming in the water. But they couldn't find the submarines. Every time they searched, the U-boats were gone. Lieutenant Commander Desmond Pears was there years later. He described what it was like. 72 hours of nightmare. Ships exploding around him. Racing at full speed toward one contact only to find nothing. Surrounded by enemies he couldn't see. 72 hours of complete helplessness. For Jean Laidlaw, stories like SC-7 weren't abstract. They were personal. Because every sinking ship carried real men. Merchant sailors who had signed up to keep Britain alive. Young men, some barely older than her, who drowned in freezing water hundreds of miles from home. She didn't know any of them personally. But she felt their deaths, she understood what was at stake, and she understood that if someone didn't figure out what the Germans were doing, and how to stop them, thousands more would die. When Jean arrived at Derby House in Liverpool, she expected a proper military facility. What she found was an attic. 8 cramped rooms on the top floor of a building that also housed the Western Approaches Command headquarters. Her commanding officer was Captain Gilbert Roberts, a retired naval officer who had been sidelined by tuberculosis years earlier. He was brilliant at wargaming, but the Navy had discarded him. Now they'd pulled him out of retirement in desperation. His orders were simple. Figure out what the U-boats are doing, develop tactics to stop them. Teach those tactics to every escort commander in the fleet. His resources? Minimal. His staff? A handful of young women from the Wrens.no sailors.no combat veterans.no one who had ever fired a torpedo or dropped a depth charge. When the Admiralty brass visited, they barely hid their contempt. This unit, this Western Approaches Tactical Unit, was a joke. A token gesture. A way for leadership to say they were doing something without actually committing real resources. Roberts didn't care that he had Jean Laidlaw, and Jean had something more valuable than ships or weapons. She had a mind that could see what others couldn't. The WATU room was bare. No computers. Those didn't exist. No sophisticated simulation equipment. Just a large floor space marked into a grid of 10-inch squares. Each square represented 1 nautical mile. Roberts and the Wrens would recreate convoy battles on that floor using chalk lines. White chalk for merchant ships and escorts. Green chalk for U-boats, nearly invisible against the brown linoleum. Wrens would crawl across the floor, plotting movements, calculating speeds, simulating what had happened in real battles based on survivor reports and intelligence intercepts. The first question Roberts asked when Jean arrived seemed basic. What is the range of a U-boat torpedo? Jean didn't know. Nobody in the room knew. Roberts had to call Admiral Max Horton, one of Britain's greatest submarine commanders from the First World War, to find out. The answer came back, approximately 1 mile. 1 mile. Jean wrote that number down. Then she asked a question that no one had thought to ask. How far across is a typical convoy? The answer, several miles. Jean stared at the floor. She did the math in her head that if a torpedo can only travel 1 mile, and convoys are several miles wide, then how are U-boats hitting ships in the center of the convoy? The escorts patrol 5,000 yards out from the convoy perimeter. That's nearly 3 miles. That if U-boats were attacking from outside, as everyone assumed, they would have to fire torpedoes from beyond the escort screen. Their torpedoes couldn't travel that far. The math didn't work. The submarines couldn't be attacking from outside. Jean got down on her hands and knees. She picked up the green chalk, and she started drawing. What Jean figured out in that cramped attic room changed everything. The U-boats weren't attacking from outside the convoy. They were attacking from inside. That here's how it worked. At night, when visibility dropped to almost nothing, U-boats would surface. Most people think submarines spend all their time underwater. They don't. A World War II U-boat was actually faster on the surface, about 17 knots, than it was submerged. Underwater, it could only manage 7 or 8 knots. So the German captains waited until dark. Then they surfaced at 17 knots. They were faster than the convoy, which typically moved at 7 to 8 knots. They would approach from behind, slip between the escort ships, dive into the middle of the convoy formation. Then they would rise to periscope depth, fire their torpedoes at point-blank range and dive deep, far below the range of the escort's sonar. While the escorts were racing around searching behind the convoy, the U-boat would simply wait, let the remaining ships pass over it, then surface again behind the convoy and escape into the darkness. It was elegant. It was ruthless. And it exploited every assumption the Royal Navy had made. Jean traced the pattern on the floor with green chalk. The other Wrens gathered around. Roberts watched in silence. When she finished, Jean stood up and looked at the diagram. "They're not ghosts," she said. "They're inside the formation. And they're escaping out the back." Roberts nodded slowly. "Then we need to trap them inside." What happened next was something no one in the Royal Navy expected. Jean Laidlaw, a 21-year-old former insurance clerk, designed a combat tactic. She called it raspberry. Why raspberry? Because, she said, it was like blowing a raspberry at Hitler. Here's how it worked. The moment a ship in the convoy was torpedoed, the escorts wouldn't chase the explosion. They wouldn't scatter looking for the U-boat behind the convoy. Instead, the escorts on the sides and rear would immediately fall back into a single line. They would form a wall across the convoy's wake. Then they would drive forward together, all sonars blasting, all depth charges ready. At the same time, the forward escorts would zigzag ahead of the convoy, blocking any escape in that direction. The U-boat would be trapped. It couldn't surface behind the convoy because the rear escorts were now there. It couldn't dive and wait because the escorts were actively hunting. It couldn't escape forward because the front was blocked. The submarine was caught in a box. The only options were surrender or death. Jean ran the simulation over and over. 0.8 times she played the U-boat. 0.8 times she tried to escape. 0.8 times raspberry caught her. But knowing a tactic works in simulation is one thing. Getting the Royal Navy to adopt it is another. The Admiralty was not interested in being lectured by women. They had centuries of tradition. They had doctrine written by men who had won the First World War. They had pride, and here was this girl, this Wren, telling them everything they believed was wrong. The institutional resistance was immense. Senior officers dismissed WATU as a waste of time. They questioned whether war games had any relevance to real combat. They whispered that Roberts had gone soft during his illness. Some refused to even attend the training courses. The system was the villain. Not any single person, though there were plenty of arrogant commanders, but the system itself. The doctrine that said we've always done it this way. The bureaucracy that valued tradition over results. The hierarchy that couldn't accept new ideas from unexpected sources. Jean watched officers walk into WATU, glance at the chalk floor, smirk at the young women crawling around with their diagrams, and walk out convinced they had nothing to learn. Every dismissal was another convoy at risk. Every rejection was more ships sinking, more men drowning, more supplies lost. The pattern she had found could save lives. But the people with power to implement it wouldn't listen. Jean didn't give up. She ran more simulations. She refined the tactics. She documented everything. Night after night, she and the other Wrens crawled across that floor, testing every scenario, every variable, every possible German countermove. When Raspberry worked against standard U-boat tactics, she asked, what if they adapt? She developed new tactics. Pineapple, beta search, step aside. Each one designed to counter a specific German approach. Each one tested dozens of times. The Wrens became relentless. They knew these simulations better than any commander in the fleet. They had spent more hours thinking about U-boat tactics than most sailors had. Spent at sea, she ran it 14 times. 14 times the same pattern emerged. 14 times she saw the weakness. The repetition wasn't tedious to Jean. It was revelation. Every simulation taught her something new about how submarines thought, how they moved, how they made decisions under pressure. She wasn't just learning tactics, she was learning to think like the enemy. The breaking point came in the autumn of 1942. The Atlantic losses had become unbearable. Between March and September, U-boats were sinking nearly 100 merchant ships per month. Roughly 2,000 merchant ships had been lost since the war began. Thousands of sailors dead. Millions of tons of supplies at the bottom of the ocean. Britain was running out of time. And then came a telegram that changed everything. Not a telegram Jean received personally, but news that rippled through WATU. A convoy had been massacred. Details emerged slowly. The escorts had followed doctrine perfectly. It hadn't mattered, the U-boats had slipped through. The casualties were staggering. Jean read the report, she studied the movements, she plotted the battle on the floor, and she saw exactly what had gone wrong. The escorts had done everything they were trained to do. But the training was wrong, the doctrine was wrong, the entire approach was wrong. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She got back on her knees and started drawing again. This time she wasn't just refining tactics. She was building a case. In November 1942, a new commander arrived. At Western approaches, Admiral Sir Max Horton. Horton was a legend. In the First World War he had commanded submarines himself. He was one of the most decorated naval officers in British history. He was also famously difficult. Impatient, demanding, quick to dismiss anything he considered a waste of his time. When Horton announced he would visit WATU to evaluate their work, Roberts knew this was their one chance. If Horton rejected Raspberry, the tactic would never be implemented. If he accepted it, the entire fleet would follow. Roberts made a decision that shocked everyone. He would not demonstrate Raspberry himself. He would let the Wrens do it. And he would put Horton in command of the U-boat. The day Horton arrived at WATU, the atmosphere was electric. Senior officers packed the room. Every eye was on the Admiral. Horton surveyed the space with obvious skepticism. Chalk lines on the floor. Young women in naval uniforms. No technology. No weapons. Just diagrams and mathematics. Roberts explained the rules. Horton would play the U-boat commander. His opponent would be a Wren named Janet O'Kell. O'Kell was 18 years old. Horton stared at her. A teenager. Against an admiral who had hunted enemy ships when this girl was in diapers. He took his position. The game began. Horton was good. He maneuvered his imaginary U-boat with the instincts of a veteran submariner. He tried to slip into the convoy from behind. He tried to dive deep and wait. He tried to surface and escape. Janet O'Kell countered every move. She anticipated him. She blocked him. She used beta search to track his position even when he thought he was hidden. Within minutes, Horton's U-boat was surrounded. Depth charges were falling. He was dead. Horton demanded a rematch. He played again. O'Kell sank him again. He played a third time. Same result. A fourth time. A fifth time. 0.5 games. 0.5 deaths. An 18-year-old Wren had just destroyed one of the Royal Navy's greatest submarine commanders. 0.5 times. Horton sat in silence. Then he stood up. He walked to the screen that separated the U-boat player from the escort player. He checked behind it. He wanted to see if she was cheating. If somehow she could see his movements. There was nothing. The game was legitimate. O'Kell had simply outthought him. What happened next was the moment everything changed. Horton turned to Roberts. His face was unreadable. Officers held their breath. Months of work had come down to this single moment. If Horton dismissed what he'd seen, WATU was finished. The tactics would be buried. The pattern would continue. More ships would sink. More men would die. Horton spoke. This works. 2 words. Teach every commander. The room exhaled. Roberts nodded. Jean Laidlaw, standing in the corner, allowed herself a small smile. The wall had cracked. The system was finally listening. From that day forward, Raspberry became standard doctrine for every escort commander in the Royal Navy. But WATU didn't stop there. Jean and the Wrens continued developing new tactics. They continued running simulations. They continued training officers who arrived from across the Allied nations. British, Canadian, Norwegian, Polish, Free, French. Even the late Duke of Edinburgh, then a young naval lieutenant, took the WATU course. Every week, a new class of commanders would arrive. They would be skeptical at first. Men who had fought real battles, who had watched friends die, who had dropped real depth charges on real submarines, being taught by young women who had never been to sea. Then they would play the games, they would lose, they would learn. They would leave understanding something they hadn't before. Roberts always began each course with the same instruction: make your mistakes here, not at sea. By the end of the war, WATU had trained more than 5,000 Allied naval officers. Every single tactic they developed was tested in the crucible of the Atlantic, and the results were undeniable. May 1943. Convoy OS 5.43 ships sailing from Liverpool to Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Germans knew it was coming. Admiral Donitz assembled more than 40 U-boats to intercept. It was supposed to be another massacre. Instead, it became a catastrophe for Germany. The battle raged for over a week. Donitz threw everything he had at the convoy. His submarines attacked from every direction. But the escorts were ready. They used Raspberry, they used beta search, they used every tactic WATU had developed. When the battle ended, 13 merchant ships had been sunk. But so had 6 U-boats, and 7 more were badly damaged. That rate of exchange, less than 2 merchant ships per submarine lost, was catastrophic for Donitz. Hitler himself told the admiral that such losses were unsustainable. May 1943 became known as Black May. The Germans called the battle around ONS 5 Die Katastrophe, the catastrophe. In that single month, 41 U-boats were destroyed. 25% of Germany's operational submarine force gone. On May 24, 1943, Donitz did something unprecedented, that he withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned. The tactics developed in a cramped Liverpool attic, by a team of young women crawling across the floor with chalk, had broken the deadliest submarine fleet in history. The impact rippled across the entire war. Before WATU, U-boat losses averaged 1 or 2 per month. After Raspberry and its companion tactics were implemented, losses quadrupled. By the summer of 1942, German submarines were being destroyed at a rate that made offensive operations increasingly suicidal. More convoys survived. More supplies reached Britain. More troops could be transported. More weapons could be shipped. The invasion of Europe, D-Day, became possible because the Atlantic was finally secured. WATU didn't just develop convoy tactics. They also planned the anti-submarine operations for Operation Overlord. The same team that had figured out how to defend convoys now figured out how to protect the largest amphibious invasion in history. Jean Laidlaw and the Wrens had done something remarkable. They had taken a war that Britain was losing and helped turn it into a war that could be won. They had outthought one of the most brilliant military minds of the 20th century, Karl Donitz, using nothing but mathematics, observation, and chalk. They had proven that genius doesn't require a uniform or a title. It just requires the opportunity to be heard. But here's the part of the story that will make you angry. After the war ended, Gilbert Roberts received a CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire. He deserved it. He had led WATU. He had fought to get the tactics implemented. He had trained thousands of officers. The Wrens? Nothing. No medals. No commendations. No official recognition whatsoever. The 66 women who had served at WATU from 1942 to 1945, who had crawled across floors, run countless simulations, trained hardened combat commanders, and developed tactics that saved thousands of lives, received no formal acknowledgement from the Royal Navy. Roberts knew this was wrong. When he went to Buckingham Palace to accept his CBE, he brought Jean Laidlaw with him. It was the only recognition she ever received. An invitation to watch someone else get a medal. After the war, the Wrens scattered. They had signed the Official Secrets Act. They couldn't talk about what they had done. Most of them simply went back to civilian life, got married, raised families, told no one. Jean Laidlaw returned to London. She became an articled clerk at an accounting firm. She studied to become a chartered accountant, at a time when less than 1% of chartered accountants in Britain were women. She passed her exams. She was admitted to membership in 1951. She was immediately appointed as a Fellow of the Institute, one of only 8 women admitted that year. She had conquered another male-dominated profession. And still, almost no one knew what she had done during the war. For decades, the story of WATU faded into obscurity. The tactical documents were classified. The veterans stayed silent. The world forgot that it wasn't until 2023, 80 years after Black May, that Jean Laidlaw's story finally reached a wider audience. A Sky History documentary called U-Boat Wargamers told the story of WATU for the first time to a mass audience. Actress Molly Vevers played Jean. In interviews before the show aired, Vevers said something that captures the tragedy perfectly. "I think it's important people know her story, and that she and the rest of the Wrens get the credit they deserve. 80 years. 80 years for the world to learn about a woman who helped win one of the most critical campaigns in modern history. 80 years for the young women who crawled across floors with chalk to finally be seen. There's a museum now. The Western Approaches HQ in Liverpool has been preserved. You can visit the same rooms where WATU operated. You can see the floors where Jean Laidlaw drew her diagrams. You can stand in the space where an 18-year-old girl defeated an admiral 5 times. In a row. On May 6, 2023, the museum held a special event commemorating the 80th anniversary of the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Descendants of the WATU attended. The wargame was demonstrated for visitors. For one day at least, the women who changed history were finally celebrated. Jean Laidlaw never sought fame. She never complained publicly about the lack of recognition. She did what so many women of her generation did, extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. With no expectation of credit, she saw a problem no one else could solve, she found the pattern no one else could see, she spoke truth to power when power didn't want to listen, and when the war was over she simply moved on. Quietly, without fanfare, without recognition. Just another woman in a world that didn't notice what women could do. But the math doesn't lie. Before Raspberry, U-boats were sinking ships at will, and Britain was months from starvation. After Raspberry, German submarine losses quadrupled, the Atlantic was secured, and the war was won. The numbers tell the story, and the numbers are Jean Laidlaw's legacy. History remembers admirals. It remembers generals. It remembers the men who stood on bridge decks and commanded fleets. It forgets the young woman on her knees with a piece of chalk. But she's the one who made the difference. She's the one who saw what no one else could see. She's the one who proved that brilliance doesn't care about rank or gender or tradition. It only cares about truth. Jean Laidlaw found the truth. She drew it on a dusty floor in Liverpool, and she saved more lives than most admirals ever will. The next time someone tells you that one person can't change the world, remember Jean Laidlaw. Remember a 21-year-old insurance clerk who volunteered for the Wrens because she wanted to help. Remember a young woman who had never been to sea, who had never fired a weapon, who had never commanded anything. Remember that she saw the pattern that trained military strategists couldn't see. Remember that she designed the tactic that turned the Battle of the Atlantic. Remember that she taught hardened combat commanders how to fight. Remember that she was never officially recognized. And remember that she did it anyway. Because history isn't made by people who wait for permission. It's made by people who see what needs to be done, and do it. Jean Laidlaw didn't ask for credit. She didn't ask for medals, she didn't ask for her name in the history books. She just asked one question: what if the submarines are inside the convoy? That question, and the answer she found, changed the war. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, if you want to hear more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because the story of Jean Laidlaw was almost lost forever. Let's make sure that never happens again.